Uh, Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Kate, for organizing this. And I'm very glad to be here, particularly at what is a very challenging time for the world. And it's at a challenging time like this that we should be having important conversations with the state of the world and how can we make it better. So I'm going to be speaking from the context of Civicus, the organization I work for. So Civicus is a global alliance of civil society organizations and activists. We work through member organizations throughout the world. We have almost over 175 countries. Most of our members are human rights and social justice organizations, and our members are required to abide by the principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In fact, they sign an undertaking of this. Our vision is of a worldwide community of inspired, committed, engaged citizens confronting the challenges facing humanity. And we believe that global challenges cross borders very easily, and we need a global community to engage on them. Problems in one part of the world impact people in another part of the world, especially in today's interconnected global affairs and global conditions. So a little bit more about Civicus. So Civicus was founded at a very hopeful time in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War in 1993, a time when we hoped that democracy would flower around the world. In fact, it was founded in Washington, D.C. by a group of civil society activists from different parts of the world. But in 2002, the organization moved to Johannesburg, which was in South Africa, once at that time considered the world's most hopeful democracy. And a lot of our members and partners are situated in the global south, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. So a lot of our perspective reflects those positions from the global south, but we also challenge the unequal nature of international relations and the post-Second World War order. So my comments will also come from that perspective. Today, I'll be speaking about two key areas of our work. One is our monitoring and research on global civic freedoms and about state of civil society, about civil society conditions, about the health and mobilizations that civil society carries out around the world. So, and I look forward to a robust conversation after this. So let's begin. So, as I mentioned, we monitor civic space around the world through a participatory platform called the Civicus Monitor, which is a research collaboration with 20 civil society organizations around the world. We define civic space loosely. It's the ability of people and organizations to come together in order to shape the political, social, and economic structure around. So it's the ability of people to speak truth to power. It's the ability of people to uncover corruption in high places. It's the ability of people to document and speak out against serious human rights abuses. It's also the ability or the conditions that enable people to seek transformative change in their societies. And civic space is predicated on the three fundamental freedoms of peaceful assembly, association, and expression, which are part of the constitutions of almost every country in the world. They are also part of customary international law. So we use a 5-point rating system to measure civic space conditions around the world. We triangulate various sources of data and information, including from the Freedom House, Freedom in the World report, the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, from VDEM's Democracy Index, but importantly also from our research partners who bring very important information about civic space conditions on the ground, how civil society reports what they are experiencing when they seek transformative social and economic change in their societies. So this is how the world looks as far as civic space conditions are concerned across the world. This has a great impact on how civil society is able to engage in societies, how civil society is able to speak truth to power. So as you can see, the redder you get, the worse the conditions are. The greener you get, the better the conditions are. There are some particular regions where civic space conditions are particularly challenging, especially in the Middle East and North Africa region, also in parts of Asia. But civic space conditions remain cause of concern around the world. And you see there's relatively better civic space conditions in Western Europe. But not just there. We also have good civic space conditions in some parts of Latin America, as well as in some other countries in Asia Pacific region. So it's not that civic space conditions are just a global north and global south issue, because the civic space conditions can also be good in global south issues, and we believe that we can actually carry economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political freedoms together. One thing that I just wanted to raise, you see those red countries. So those red countries are where 28% of the world's population live. In these countries, criticizing anybody in government, uncovering serious misgovernance issues, can carry very serious consequences. It can get one thrown in prison for a long period of time. It can get civil society organizations shut down, and it can force someone to go into exile. So these are some of the challenges that we see around. So this is a global map of where you see where people live.
Wow.
So according to our research, 85% of the world's population live in countries where there are very serious restrictions in the world. And this has an impact on the fight against corruption, on the fight to overcome discrimination and structural challenges in our societies. And importantly, in the quest to create peaceful, just, equal, and sustainable society that we at Civicus seek to promote. Over 2022, the three biggest restrictions that we saw was harassment and intimidation of activists and journalists and society organizations to impede them from continuing their human work. We also saw arbitrary detention of protesters as punishment from speaking out against those who hold power, as well as restrictive laws. Restrictive laws that prevent funding from international sources, that prevent civil society organizations from getting funding from domestic sources, as well as repurposing of the counterterrorism discourse, repurposing of the security discourse to basically prevent people from speaking out against those who hold power and restrict the freedom of speech in these countries. So every few months, we also publish a watch list on the Civicus Monitor. This watch list looks at some of the conditions that could lead to increased civic space restrictions. Countries included in the watch list are not countries necessarily which have the worst civic space conditions, but where we feel that civic space restrictions will get challenged, and oftentimes this is in relation to elections. It could be in relation to restrictions on media freedom, but we definitely see as elections approach, civil society activists, political opponents of the government of the day, particularly in countries where civic space conditions are poor, tend to be persecuted. In our recent watch list, we included Bangladesh. So there's two people you see on the left side. They are two civil society activists from an organization called Odekar in Bangladesh. Odekar produced a report 10 years ago that documented extrajudicial executions in Bangladesh. Since then, cases were registered against the organization, against its leadership, and those cases went on for 10 years, and they were imprisoned for 2 years. They are currently out on bail because the High Court found that there were serious infirmities in the way their trial was conducted. But we have also included United Arab Emirates in the civic space watch list. UAE will be hosting the COP28 summit, which is going to be looking at global conditions and ensure agreements on climate change and addressing the climate challenges that the world faces. And while it still has many own challenges with the political prisoners and the exercise of international freedom. So if you host an international meeting, you must also respect the international rules and laws within the international human rights framework. So that's why some countries have been included. In Ecuador, there were serious civic space restrictions in the run-up to the election, including on freedom of expression. And in Senegal, the president is seeking to have another term in office, which many consider unconstitutional. So we included these countries in the civic space watch list. So now I want to move. I have to.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to move over to our State of Civil Society report, which looks at global conditions in which civil society operates and how civil society is responding to global challenges of the day. Oh, perfect. That should be good. So our State of Civil Society report that covers from the protests in Iran, which took place over the course of 2022 and are still continuing for women's right to equality and their right to wear what they like. Our State of Civil Society report looks at the health and conditions for civil society around the world. It's a civil society report that we published after getting information from civil society activists, and it's based on practitioner perspectives. And we deconstruct global events from its civil society lens. So I want to share some trends. So as we know, oftentimes in the times of crisis, civil society are oftentimes the first responder to global crisis, whether it's conflict, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's political upheaval in a country. And for this, we have seen that civil society organizations and activists are often persecuted precisely because of what they do, because of the principled action they may take when two belligerents are acting out in the case of a conflict or when they point out the serious infirmities in governments. So in Russia, when the country invaded Ukraine, the country's oldest human rights organization, Memorial, was shut down. They had their registration cancelled. In Afghanistan, activists and organizations that seek women's right to education, that seek education for girls, those organizations have been hounded and have been attacked. In Italy, a number of humanitarian groups that have rescued migrants from sea who would otherwise have drowned have been persecuted and have been charged for rescuing people. In Mali, organizations and activists that oppose the coup in the country, they've been hounded. Their funding from international sources has been cut down to prevent them from speaking out against the military regime. In Ethiopia, where a civil war has raged for a long time, civil society organizations have been prevented from reporting on the conflict, that journalists have been harassed, and for documenting mass atrocities. A second trend is about global governance failures. As you can see, the post-Second World War order, if you look at the UN Charter, in the preamble, it says we seek to protect future generations from the scourge of war. So despite these words, the world seems to be driven by conflict, as the current conflict in Israel-Palestine continues to show. The war in Ukraine continues to go on. It's a failure of the global governance system. But these are not the only two conflicts that are raging around the world. There have been wars in Syria, in Yemen, in the Sahel region in Africa, in Sudan, where there's a conflict and military rule being imposed after people's uprising, in Myanmar, where again there continues to be very serious challenges due to military rule in the country. And because of these global governance failures, in a sense, to prevent conflict, we are also seeing the Sustainable Development Goals, which are arguably the greatest ever human endeavor to create peaceful, just, equal, and sustainable societies. They're completely off track. The UN Secretary General, in his own SDG report, lamented that just 15% of the goals are on track. 30% of the goals since 2015, which was a very optimistic moment when the whole world agreed on a global governance framework, have actually regressed or have not moved since the time they were put in place. Now, there are several challenges with this, but two challenges I want to highlight, which are particularly challenging. Some states have introduced the notion of cultural relativism in the implementation of the International Human Rights Framework. So they say that that human rights are not universal, they must be interpreted in accordance to cultural norms, which means the human quest for equality, for freedom, to be treated with dignity, is not something that is universal and which is a huge challenge. And the second is the notion of development with national characteristics, which has been introduced by some states. So the different models of development which are pushed forward by Gulf monarchies, pushed forward by China for development with national characteristics. Basically, you need that Agenda 2030, which is a set of 17 goals, 169 associated targets. These targets should be interdependent and be connected to each other, but countries say they want to do their own development paths despite agreeing on a integrated agenda, and which is the challenge, and which leads to searing economic inequality and climate action. Oxfam, the international organization, continues to report that every year that the number of billionaires continues to increase who own as much wealth as half the world's population. So it remains a huge challenge. But we are seeing around the world that people are feeling economic pain around the world, partly due to market economics, where a certain minority of people have gotten extremely rich, and this is due to also due to greater emphasis on privatization of public services, concentration of wealth in a few hands, and this has led to protests where people feel sheer desperation. Recently, we've seen protests in Kenya, we've seen protests in Syria, in Sri Lanka. In 2022, there were huge protests against economic mismanagement in that country. In Indonesia, there were protests when fuel subsidies were removed in the country, which would have hurt poorest people the most. In Ghana, the cost of living crisis got people out onto the street. And these are just some illustrative examples that continue to abound around the world. But in our finding on the Civicus monitor, we saw that there were major protests in over 130 countries. So when people come out on the streets to protest, means that they feel extremely desperate and feel extremely challenged, and which remains a huge challenge. And we also find, in many cases, when people find no other avenue, the right to protest is coming under attack. The right to peaceful protest led to many important changes in our societies, from decolonization to women's quest for equal rights, to highlighting the climate emergency by young people at the moment, and it also about on racial justice, so Black Lives Matter protest. But the right to protest is consistently being attacked, and according to our research in 2022, in Kazakhstan, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, 200 protesters were killed. In Iran, women's rights protesters have been brutalized, and there have also been attacks on protests in Peru due to the political challenges in that country. And even in democracy, where we thought the argument for peaceful protest had been won, there have been challenges with strong arming of peaceful protesters in Germany, Netherlands, and in the UK. Legislation has been introduced that makes it very difficult for climate action protesters to protest on the streets, and can lead to severe legal repercussions against them. But more worryingly, facial recognition technologies are being used, excessive surveillance is being carried out against people's right to express democratic dissent, which is a huge challenge. And it brings me to my next point about how democracy is being eroded around the world. In fact, democracy is facing a stress test. There's a new phenomena, which is not so new, but which has become extremely concentrated in the current scenario, is the rise of strongman populist leaders. These people believe in electoral politics. They appeal to people's nationalistic tendencies. They believe in creating an aura around a culture at a particular time, and culture is a static thing, and they try to hark back to a particular time when there was the golden age in a country. And that remains a huge challenge. In almost every democracy in the world, there's increasing political polarization at the moment through the rise of nationalist politics, which is becoming a huge challenge, where checks and balances are being eroded. And we've seen trends where judiciaries have been attacked, where judicial independence has been eroded through winner-take-all politics, where the political party of the day, which wins elections, then does not want to engage in reasoned debate, which is becoming much harder. So we've seen this following out of constitutional democracy in many parts of the world, in Tunisia, in India, in the Philippines, Hungary, in Israel most recently, and also here in the United States, the hollowing of democracy continues. And we've also seen a new phenomena of coups happening in West Africa, where in a whole belt of countries around the world, in Burkina Faso, in Chad, in Niger, in Gabon, in Mali, and also people in some instances coming out onto the streets in support of coups, which again leads to huge challenges, but is also dissatisfaction with how democracy is being run by strongman leaders. And this is all very much connected to disinformation. In fact, disinformation is skewing public discourse. There's a lot, the internet is being weaponized to spread propaganda, and it's also very much connected to the complicity of the tech industry, where algorithms that feed people's compulsive behaviors, that lead to biases, that lead to prejudice being put against minorities, prejudice being put against those who have an alternative viewpoint, then what is a majoritarian opinion is a huge challenge and leads to greater conflict. And we see this particularly in the run-up to elections, as it happened in Brazil's election recently, it happened in the Czech Republic, it's happening in the US elections too. And also it continues to happen in support of war and aggressive actions, as it's happening in the Middle East and North Africa. It's also happening in Russia. But despite all these somewhat depressing trends, we're also seeing that civil society is actually continuing to keep up with the momentum. And we've also seen victories for women's rights and LGBTQI+ rights. In fact, despite some of the regression on sexual and reproductive freedoms in the United States, we've seen in the Americas there have actually been advances in sexual and reproductive freedoms on the right to an abortion in Colombia, in Mexico. There's also been advances on same-sex marriage, where people's right to love and marry who they want. In Switzerland, where a referendum was carried out. We've also seen advances in Mexico, in Chile, where a new law that enables same-sex marriage has come into play. We've seen the striking down of legislation that from colonial era that criminalized same-sex relations in Antigua and Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, in Barbuda, and most recently in Mauritius, where civil society action and organizing, working with the courts, has led to repeal of discriminatory laws. And civil society is continuing to push the envelope on climate action. In fact, young people through the Fridays for Future movement, through the Milk Tea Alliances in Southeast Asia, are continuing to highlight democratic rights, equality, justice, and continue to push for peaceful societies. And in this whole scenario, we're also seeing that civil society action is being reinvented. In fact, through greater use of communication tools, people are able to express solidarity across borders, people are able to engage with each other. And we have hope that despite the current times we live in, despite all the conflict and crisis that are there, despite all the inequality that appears to be increasing very worryingly, that there will be some change, because young people are more progressive minded. They believe in values of humanity and dignity, and we are seeing already that the civil society arena is reinventing itself through a lot of digital organizing that happens through spontaneous people's protests, which means that people are civically engaged in a country. People continue to care about what is happening in their country. They continue to care about each other. So let me stop there, and be very happy to engage on any questions. But if you'd like to read a State of Civil Society report, it's available here on this in multiple languages.
Yes, thank you very much, Stanley, for the presentations. I would like to invite participants for questions first.
I was wondering, have you done a contemporary comparison of what, like the data you showed in the map with the colors? What's the time period that's reflecting? And is there a comparison with the previous time period? And then obviously my related question is that what is the reason why you think these changes have taken place over the last decade or 2 decades?
Thank you. Sure. Do you want me to ask the question at time?
Maybe one more questions from her.
Thank you for the presentation. I think we can generally agree that a lot of this is related to the rise of liberal democracies, and populism. But I also want to know if you have any data or in your own opinion on how this is also a function of how the international development industry, if you will, supports organizations that have administrative capacity. And therefore, in every country, especially in the global south, we have a few 5, 10 tops organizations that always get the international funding from USA, European Union, etc. And so the diversity of civil society organizations has not increased a lot in the past 2 decades. And as a result, it's very easy to just target the few who have this capacity. And because we don't have new civil society organizations rising, then the space for civic action also reduces as these very traditional, well-established, administratively capable organizations get weaker, out of date, and sometimes out of touch with the grassroots.
Thank you. So just on the first question, so on the data that we have, so firstly, if you look at the first 5 decades of the 20th century, human rights and social justice values tended to advance. You always had more progressive gains. Unfortunately, after 9/11, what happened is that Western democracy is often talked about having higher standards as far as the right to fair trial was concerned, as far as the right to human dignity was concerned. They themselves started to lower those standards. And that resulted in a situation where a number of autocratic regimes, dictatorial regimes, they started to follow suit and said, look, if these countries can reduce their own standards, then we can also follow through. And also because of the changes in global economies, because the rebalancing of the global order, where human rights principles or human rights values or democratic values are not oftentimes reflected in foreign policies of all countries. So things have started to change for those who express democratic dissent. As far as our data is concerned, civil society had been advocating for a long time in aid and development effectiveness conversations that we create an emphasis on enabling environments for civil society. So in 2011, the Busan Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation talked about enabling environments for civil society. So at that time, we saw that there were new laws that were being introduced. Many of the people who we worked with were being imprisoned because they had criticized somebody, their organizations were being shut down, or people getting funding because they were critical of those in power. So we wanted to find a way how can we document this. So we started our documentation through the Civic monitor, which is through the site. So this is the people who are on the graph. So this is Civicus monitor. If you just Google Civicus monitor, you can see in 2017 where we looked at global conditions, looked at various sources of data and information. So this is 5 years old data. So within this data, every year we upgrade and downgrade countries based on what the global conditions are. If the media is being allowed to speak truth to power, if there's concentration of media, looking at how activists are engaging, or how the government generally treat democratic dissent, if investigative agencies are not being weaponized to attack those who may be having alternative views. So based on that, every year we do an upgrade and downgrade based on these countries. So over 5 years, we have comparative data on how things have changed, for the better or for worse. But it seems to us that the things have gotten worse or in the
Thank you.
On the international development industry, that's a good question that you talk about. Unfortunately, the way the world stands now is that a lot of the organizations that seek accountability, that seek more transparency, that's creator participation. They are supported by a handful of Western democracies. At Civicus, as a South-based global alliance, we've been actually pushing democratic countries in the global South to actually support human rights and social justice values, to actually include democracy promotion in their foreign policies. Unfortunately, we live in an era of transactional diplomacy. We live in an era of nationalist populism. So where oftentimes civil society oftentimes also gets into this discourse, and it's very easy to write off an organization or a journalist as an agent of Western power. That has become sort of a red herring. But that said, what you're saying is yes, certainly it's something that we have been pushing for very much at Civicus. That firstly, a lot of the international development funding, if you look at the OECD development funding, a lot of that all actually goes to international civil society organizations, and very few of it actually reaches to organizations and activists that work on the ground. So there's a whole move towards localization and to ensure that the money goes to organizations working in community and organizations that actually have accountability, true accountability to the communities they serve, not accountability, because organizations can have very sophisticated finance departments that are able to answer to to finance proposals, or who are able to agree with government reporting requirements, which oftentimes they're the owners. So they tend to get a share of the funding, and so that is something that we've been pushing for, that international funding for development should be sent to smaller organizations on the ground. But this remains a challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. So 2 more questions.
My question is centered around the role of civil society in innovation, and especially in the economic and social impact. Even the quadruple helix framework has civil society or public as one of the 4 key actors in terms of advancing innovation. And one of your slides has one point saying people are mobilizing due to economic pain. So I'm wondering if there is any study that your organization or any similar organization has done in terms of measuring the impact on the economy, or maybe on the social outcomes of this mobilizing of people and not being able to participate in the innovation process.
So if I understand your question correctly, is that when people are mobilizing, it may have economic impacts on innovation?
Economic as well as impact on social outcomes.
My question is about like the rise and the role of non-state actors, specifically corporations, in playing an increasing role in regulating people power and civil society, and how you see that kind of changing the way you maybe constructed in that Civicus in the future.
So especially around corporate power, that's that question. Yeah. So on the first question on people mobilizing, we start with an assumption that when people mobilize and come out on the streets, it's an act of desperation, that they feel powerless against the existing structures and frameworks that exist within the governance of a country, that they don't feel that they can get their position or get what their needs are addressed through that system. So that's why they come out onto the streets. So which means that the other work that they're doing oftentimes gets disrupted, but that is a choice to ensure that there is more there's more equity in society, there's justice against the crimes that are committed, or they want to ensure that people's needs are met. So that's why they just tend to mobilize. As far as studies are concerned on the impact of protests on the economy, I would say perhaps maybe look at protests. Oxfam has several reports, but so that might be something to look at. But it'd be hard to quantify something like that. And again, I would say that we need to look at things in a holistic way. So it's about it's not just about economic growth. And unfortunately, the economic growth model has gotten us where we are at the moment, where economic growth means wealth accumulation and creation by a few wealthy people, by corporations, is oftentimes taken as a rise in per capita GDP. But we actually need to look at poverty statistics and whether people's basic needs are met, which sort of answers your question also in a sense that almost every country of the world we've seen, there's a greater concentration of wealth that's happening. So it's a small bunch of political and economic elites that oftentimes tend to hold power. So we find people who are very wealthy coming into politics, people who are in politics, having expensive business interests, which is bleeding into international decision making as well as national decision making. So even at the international space, not immune private sector influence, and which is something that civil society has oftentimes talked about, because private sector influence is oftentimes driven by private interests. It's driven by interests of a few, whereas civil society seeks to ensure that the interests of the most disenfranchised, the most marginalized, those who are not counted in the political priorities of the government of the day are taken into account. But we are living in a time of eye-watering inequality. It's very unfair that in a time when private companies can send people onto, into outer space, when rockets are enabled, and there is so much technological advances, the wealth has been created on such an exponential stage, on such an exponential scale, that people should still go hungry. So that remains the huge paradox of our time, that there are people who don't have enough to eat in a day, and in a time when there is so much wealth that exists for vanity projects by billions.
Okay, is there any more questions?
So thank you for the presentation. And I used to run a small nonprofit back in South Korea, and then I became a journalist because I couldn't make it we have a bit. And with journalism, I was working closely with CSOs, and I witnessed there was too many shortages. There was lack of funding, there was lack of manpower, and because donations or contributions from the public is not that common in South Korea, most CSOs rely on government subsidies. And as the political shift goes on, like change of administrations or something, the CSOs shift with it. So they're not free to impose to certain government policies because they are the main funding source. So what are your thoughts about to make CSOs in the world economically, financially sustainable?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think civil society organizations around the world are struggling. Part of it is also part of what I spoke about is the move to the right towards more nationalistic politics in many countries. So where people are not investing so much in international development, in seeing civil society as a good in itself. And even when funders, whether they're international development agencies, firstly international development agencies, predilections can change depending on which government there is, depending on what the leaders of that of that country want. So which has huge impacts on civil society that is working with communities. The other in this gap, oftentimes private foundations have sought to fill the gap, which are again, of course, built upon the wealth created by some very wealthy people, but they are independent private foundations that, of course, seek to develop their policies on where they give and how they give, according to what needs they see across the world. But it remains hugely challenging. So what has happened is that the civil society in the United States is continuing to evolve. So one of the things that a lot of people who want to engage in public service initiatives are now starting to experiment with social enterprises. So so they raise some funding to continue their work, which has its own challenges because then you're fundraising and service to communities. There's a tension between that. Civil society organizations have been pushing for a very long time that developed countries, so countries that are considered part of the global north, should contribute 0.7% of their gross national income to international development work, and within that, they should support civil society. They should see civil society as independent development actors. Not all global north countries contribute 0.7%, and also there are very wealthy countries that have huge economies that don't consider themselves as global north. So their development is again more challenged. And at the national level, you have the funding which you raise is very important because you have to then follow you can't be independent if you criticize the government. If you're getting government funding, your funding gets reduced. So that remains a big challenge. So the answer in this way is to create formally consolidated independent funds within the government. Certain amounts of monies can be set aside. Those funds are included civil society organizations. They are administered by by an independent group of experts or people to ensure that those funds are properly kept, but also to really persuade a greater emphasis on philanthropy. So that is really, very critical. And also public education, because in many of the big international organizations also rely on international funding. For example, Greenpeace gets individual funding from people who actually believe in climate justice issues. A lot of the racial justice movements have actually been able to attract funding, crowdsourced funding. And also through power of volunteering, but it remains a huge challenge. So I think we really need to create cultures of giving, both through volunteerism and through people's funds to ensure that social justice, constitutional values are.
Thank you very much. So because we also have these sessions online, so is there any questions from? There is on there is screen. So I think there is 3 questions from others. Maybe you can answer it shortly for the division. Thank you.
So yes, the question happens also against, I think, the question on Africa about organizations that are able to yes, that restrictive NGO law. So oftentimes it goes with the state of democracy in a country or in a region. If democratic values are strong, there is greater support for the right to express democratic dissent, and civil society organizations oftentimes express democratic dissent. They are in fact the conscious keepers of a nation. They are the ones who ask difficult questions, those who hold power, and it depends on the government of the day, which actually embraces democratic dissent and it wants to ensure better governance. And oftentimes in many parts of the world, including in Africa, we have regimes that are not fully democratic, that don't always adhere to democratic principles. But this is not an African issue. This is a global issue. In many parts of the world, we have governments and leaders who don't subscribe to democratic values. So that percolates down into the sorts of laws that are introduced. In fact, we have found that foreign funding laws, foreign donations laws prevent civil society organizations from getting funding in many parts of the world. Also, the issue of anti-LGBT legislation has been introduced, and in Africa it's become quite a contentious issue. And our argument is this, that often, if you look at the discourse on same-sex marriage, on LGBTQI plus rights, it oftentimes comes from colonial times, and there used to be a greater study or perhaps more in-depth conversation on where the actual level of discrimination comes from. There are several regional networks in Africa. In fact, one of the organizations that I would recommend is the Defend Defenders. That's an excellent group of African rights defenders who work across the continent. There are also, West Africa Civil Society Initiative. There's also Africans Rising, which is a global movement of African civil society activists. So the civil society is thriving and strong in Africa. In fact, a lot of the movement happens in civil society when political conditions are challenging and economic conditions remain difficult for majority of populations, and that leads to greater resilience from within civil society. The question from human rights. Civicus membership seems less relative to the potential. Does it not limit the effectiveness? So I'm not sure I fully understand the question about Civicus membership being less relative to potential. We believe that these are difficult times for our members who believe in social justice and human rights values. And we would say that actually it's in times like this when these values are being contested, when there's global conflict, when international cooperation is challenged, that the value that civil society is needed more than ever to ensure that there are integrated solutions to global challenges, that the international human rights and development framework is upheld. So yes, in many places, our effectiveness is being reduced because of the global conditions that we spoke about the rising of, in autocratic regimes. But we believe that ultimately civil society organizing the people's ability to find connections across borders and human rights struggles will actually overcome this, just as the anti-colonials struggles were able to get success. Struggles for women's justice and equality have been able to make inroads, struggle for racial justice and been able to make inroads. So we believe that the struggle for democracy and human rights will have impacts, especially because young people have a very different way of looking at things on human rights and social justice issues. How can civil societies coordinate better across borders? Definitely by connections, by greater solidarity. I think we all need to understand that what happens in one part of the world, if there's a conflict, if there's oppression against peoples in one part of the world, it's going to have many ramifications across. If there's a war in one country, it leads to an exodus of people, it leads to a refugee crisis in another part of the world. If people are being persecuted in one part of the world, they have to go into exile. So it already makes challenge. It already that issue spreads across borders. So through creating networks, that's a very important way. But solidarity is absolutely crucial for civil society to connect across borders, and also to use the international human rights framework. The international human rights framework was actually something that the international community has developed. It's owned by the international community. The Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, was signed by all leaders across the world. So they have commitments on gender justice, they have commitments on addressing inequality, they have commitments on advancing climate justice, they have commitments on addressing corruption, they have commitments on responsibility with participatory decision making. Fortunately, those commitments remain a work in progress.
Thank you very much, Mandy, for the discussion today, and also thank you very much for all the participants for the great questions, and also participants from online for the questions that asked. Also, I want to remind all of the guests to sign in the QR code that we mentioned in the beginning, and also composting our lunch material. And I also want to inform you that after this event, we will have a curry chat with Mandeep Tiwani at 1:15 in the Perkins conference room in the Rubenstein, 429 in the Harvard Kennedy School. So you can go straightly after this event to that curry chat with you. Thank you very much for all coming here. Thank you.